Hello, shalom, and hello. My name is Sandra Simovic, and I'm the Israeli Consul General for Southern Germany. I'm very, very happy to welcome you to today's webinar, Is Corona a Game Changer in Global Politics? A lot has been said and is being said about Corona. How did it start? How can we contain it? What are the right measures? When will we find a vaccine? But we thought it's about time to have an in-depth discussion about the global impacts of the pandemic. How does the corona affect the global politics? What is the role now of the global players? How does it affect international trade? What is the growing importance of technology? Will the crisis strengthen national protectionism and weaken international cooperation, or maybe the other way around? All this question and many more will be discussed today in what I'm sure will be a very, very interesting and enlightening discussion. I'm particularly happy that today's event, webinar, is the result of a cooperation between the Consulate, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, represented by my dear colleague, Dr. Uri Resnick, Director of Policy Planning and Net Assessment, and the Bundeswehr University in Munich, represented by Dr. Stephan Stetter, Professor for International Politics and Conflict Studies. I want also to thank very much the Bundeswehr University, the President of the Bundeswehr University, Professor Merit Niehaus, for the very good cooperation all year round. So thank you again very much, and I want to welcome you to this event hosted by the Director of our academic department, Dr. Grimmeisen. Enjoy.
Thank you, Sandra, for your wonderful greeting. I also want to welcome Dr. Uri Resnick and Dr. Stephan Stetter to our webinar, and thank you for taking the time to discuss with us. I want to welcome our audience as well. Thank you for being with us today. And I also want to invite you to join our discussion by commenting below our live video on the Facebook side of the Consulate. Corona caught us by surprise, and many countries were not prepared for it. The pandemic shook our daily routine and changed our daily lives dramatically. We had to be confined to our homes and cut any contact, even to our closest family. Many basic infrastructures found themselves unable to adapt to the new circumstances properly. Most of the governments had to deal with dilemmas they had never experienced before. In some countries, even the health infrastructure collapsed. At the same time, we are seeing demonstrations against the hygiene measures, where participants spread intangible conspiracy theories about the coronavirus. Anti-Semitism and racial discrimination are on the rise. The corona pandemic did not only have drastic effects on our social life, but also on global affairs. The economy worldwide experienced a massive shock. Trade and production dropped massively. International travel became impossible and brought the aviation industry to an almost shutdown. Consequently, we are seeing a growing rate of unemployment and severely depressed growth forecasts. Many governments, which try to defend their population and industry, chose protectionist measures. In particular, they stopped the export of relevant medical supplies and equipment. Isolationist politics also affect international cooperation. We can already see that main contributors to multilateral organizations, like to the World Health Organizations, are reducing their contributions. These developments will have a harder effect on countries with poor economic and living conditions and unsettle their already precarious political stability. Looking at all these worrisome developments, I'm very happy to be able to introduce to you two experts on international politics who will assess the current situation for us. Dr. Uri Resnick is an Israeli diplomat and associate member of the Federman Center for the Study of Rationality at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he's currently the Director of Policy Planning and Net Assessment at Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Before, he served as Director of International Security Affairs in the Policy and Political Military Bureau in the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And Dr. Resnick has authored numerous articles in conflict studies. Dr. Stephan Stetter is Professor of International Politics and Conflict Studies at the Bundeswehr University Munich. His research priorities are theories of international politics and global modernity. And his research work appears in leading journals and with leading book publishers. From 2012 to 2018, Stephan Stetter was a co-speaker of the International Relations section of the German Association of Political Science. And Stephan Stetter is also a member of the advisory board of the Center for Israel Studies at the Ludwig-Maximilians University in Munich. So without further ado, I'm very happy to hand over the conversation to my guests and would like to ask you to start with short portrayals of our current regional situations. And I would like Dr. Resnick to start with Israel and the Middle East, and then I would like to ask Stephan Stetter to do the same for Germany and the European Union. Uri, go.
Okay, thank you very much, Julie. Good morning to everybody. So just a few words then briefly about the situation in Israel as it appears now, and then sort of zoom out a little bit onto the broader region. So Israel actually early on took very strict lockdown measures, and it seemed, I would say, for many, many weeks on end that we had managed to flatten the curve, as it is said, and we're in a good situation such that I would say for the last month, we've been engaged in a process of easing the lockdown measures. To date, we have almost 20,000 cases, recorded cases, and 303 fatalities from COVID. If we had held this discussion 2 weeks ago, this would be where we leave that assessment, except this is the nature, I guess, of the challenge that we're facing. And the truth is that in the last week or so, we've seen a resurgence in cases here in Israel, despite the easing of lockdown. So our schools have been open and public transportation is open, hotels have been open, the beaches, pubs, restaurants, and so on. But we are seeing, in fact, that the virus is rearing its head again. It's early to say how we're going to proceed from here on, but in a sense, we're seeing the foothills of a rising second wave right now. So we'll see. It's, as I say, it's early to say how it will progress and whether we're going to have to reimpose lockdown measures. But that's the current situation in Israel. And I would say, even though we are still party to a group of countries and different dialogues of countries that have been relatively successful in mitigating the effects of the virus and employing effective measures against it, as I say, it's still a precarious situation. In a way, there's a similar kind of sense more regionally. So if it appeared for the first period of the virus, starting in February and then through March, that the Middle Eastern countries weren't feeling the full brunt of rising curves in cases and in fatalities, there's definitely an uptick just looking around the region generally. So whether it's Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Jordan, obviously Iran was a major epicenter at the outset. They're also experiencing in the last couple of weeks a resurgence in cases since the beginning of June. And even some of the record rates of infection were recorded in this last week. So we're by no means done. Now, if we're looking, Israel is really, it's an outlier in the region in terms of the capacity of its health system and in terms, obviously, of its the health of the economy. But broadly speaking, in the region, we're talking about an extremely vulnerable region, both in terms of the health infrastructure that's in place to deal specifically with the challenge, the immediate public health challenge of the virus, but also the state of the economies in much of the countries around the region. So again, just sweeping around us, whether it's North African countries in Egypt or Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, obviously Iran, and swinging up through Syria, obviously with its geopolitical morass, and up to Turkey, we're looking at a region which is many of the regimes in which are particularly vulnerable. And to understand the dynamic from a policy planning perspective of the links between sort of the logical links between the dimensions of the conflict. To put it quite simply, there's the health crisis, which feeds into an economic crisis, which feeds into a social crisis, which feeds into a potential political crisis. So if I had to assess the risk, if we were risk analysts looking at the region, I would say that even without an uptick in health cases in the region, it's extremely vulnerable economically. So given now that we are witnessing the uptick of a second wave, or even the continuation of a first wave in some cases, the prognosis looks problematic for the region in terms of what we can expect in terms of social and political stability. And I would say there are other dimensions that are just worth mentioning very briefly. There's of course the oil, the drop in oil prices, which just hits major oil exporters in the region disproportionately hard. So those countries, whether the Gulf countries or countries like Saudi Arabia, are so dependent on the export of oil, and also on things like religious tourism, the Hajj. These are just sectors, major contributors to growth and to gross domestic product in these countries, which are just decimated. So that's an additional effect. We can also, and we need to also pay attention to the fact that an economic crisis in many of these countries also risks, and we're already seeing the beginnings of this, in a burgeoning food crisis. So if we're talking about food security, that's another major concern, again, sweeping from North Africa throughout the Maghreb and to the Sahel. This is something we need to be very cognizant of, both Israel as a neighbor, but the international community as well. Especially given the fact, we're going to speak maybe a little bit later on in the talk about connections with Europe and Israel and the region. Food crisis often is correlated with a migration issue and a refugee crisis, and this is something obviously which needs to be of concern to European countries. So I'm sorry to be the bearer of not such optimistic news, but I think the region, it's one of the regions in the world which is going to be hit disproportionately by COVID, unfortunately.
Thank you, Uri. Stephan, I hand the word over to you. Can you do the same for Germany and the European Union?
Yes, thank you so much, Julia, also for hosting this talk. It's really a pleasure to be with you and Uri here and discussing the corona crisis. I think if you look at the situation in Germany and in Europe, what Uri just said is that we are by no means done is also a good description of the situation here in Europe and in Germany. There is a crisis on the health front. There's an economic challenge, and it's a political challenge as well. And that is also something I think we should talk about. How does this affect politics? We see the demonstrations you have referred to. We see the issue of how citizens relate to the pandemic. And I think this is a very important topic as well. Europe was hit heavily for a while. Europe was the epicenter of the pandemic, as the World Health Organization has emphasized at the time. This has shifted now to some extent. The first wave appears to be over, both in Germany and in Europe. The second wave, of which we see signs in Israel and other places, hasn't really arrived here. So what we see in Germany and in Europe is that we're in the dance period, as this is called. The tiger and the dance. The virus is the tiger. It's a wild beast, and it has been possible now to contain some of the worst effects it had, in particular on other countries in Europe. Germany was hit heavily in terms of the cases, but in terms of the number of people who died from COVID-19, the numbers are much smaller. So if we look at this situation, Germany was hit by the virus quite early on during the pandemic, in particular in specific regions. I would say that is the southern parts of Germany, the states of Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and the most populous German state, North Rhine-Westphalia. What is interesting here is that these are also the most interconnected states within the Federal Republic of Germany. These are the states which are the most prosperous states. People travel. They probably came back from hotspots during the winter season, or these are states which are linked to the global economy. And we could see that the number of cases in these states were higher than in other states within Germany, which were less exposed to the global economy, and where the levels of prosperity were somewhat lower. So that was the situation in Germany. Germany moved early on in a coordinated effort between the federal government and the states. And you have to keep in mind here that health issues is not the prerogative of the federal government. It's the responsibility of the federal states. But the federal government, Chancellor Merkel and the federal government were coordinating these efforts in collaboration with the prime ministers of the 16 German states. And lockdown measures set in quite early in this period. And this was also a completely novel experience. Nobody has ever experienced this in our lifetime. Maybe we saw some Hollywood movies where we were aware that such lockdown measures are possible, but it has never happened before. So schools closed, kindergartens closed. We started to wear masks. I think this is a global phenomenon. Most people who listen to us are aware of this. I just would like to emphasize that this was introduced in Germany quite early on. There was a very big discussion on the effect this would have on the German health system, on hospitals, the number of ventilators, etc. Whether are hospitals able to treat a wave, a tsunami of cases, which would probably come to hospitals. And fortunately, this was the case. The hospital system, the health system was able to deal with the number of cases. The situation then, if we move on to the European picture, was less positive in some other European states. In particular, Spain, France, and Italy stand out here. Italy and in the Milano region, Bergamo, Madrid in Spain, and Paris in France. These were big hotspots, and we can see in these countries that the number of cases are quite similar to Germany, but the number of dead people has been much higher. There are different reasons for that, which are related to demography, to the distribution of the population according to age cohorts, also the intensity with which specific hotspots were hit. I think this is different in Madrid and Milan compared to places in Germany. A big effect of this has been that the European borders, which are open under the Schengen system, Europe is not only an internal market, it's a polity. We have open borders in Europe, and these borders were closed early on during the pandemic. And there has also been a crisis early on in European governance to the extent that people in different parts of Europe felt we are left alone. Others probably do better in Europe, but they don't help us. This was something which happened in the first weeks of the pandemic when everybody struggled with understanding what is going on. But I think this has tremendously changed. We will talk about this later. I think the response of the European Union and also the solidarity between governments and people in Europe has been very strong. It hasn't been during the first 2 or 3 weeks of the pandemic, but this has definitely changed. So that is the European perspective. And we, of course, also should put into the picture those European states which are not in the European Union and which have a particularly high number of cases. And this is the United Kingdom and Russia. These are two cases we should, of course, not forget here in this discussion.
Okay, thank you, Uri and Stephan, for opening the talk by giving us a short insight in where we stand, like Germany, European Union, Israel, and the Middle East. Can we take the discussion now on like the global level, and can you tell us what is the situation worldwide right now? Like it's really hard to follow. We counted the numbers here in the neighborhood or in the city. Now we're sort of relieved it's going down, or in Israel it's going up a little bit again. But what's happening worldwide, also to international cooperation? And maybe can you give us positive as well as negative examples of national and multilateral approaches to the pandemic? Or is this assessment, is it too early? I don't know. Uri, you want to start?
Okay. So I think when we set out in our department, in our bureau, it was already sort of late March when we first kind of were thinking about this. And at the time, there was a study that came out by the Imperial College in London trying to estimate at the time, very early on, but a very serious and in-depth study that they did with the best researchers there on kind of trying to bound the lowercase to highest case of what could be expected globally. And they since, I think, revised some of their assessments, but we based our analysis on their assessments. And they drew a continuum between a best case scenario globally of 2 million fatalities and a worst case of tens of millions, 30 million and so on. And I think that for a while in April, it seemed that we were flattening the curve in the epicenter at the time, which was primarily in Europe, as Stephan was noting, with what I think at the time was seen as a remarkable lack of cases in sort of the global south, whether it was, you know, South America, Latin America, Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and so on. And sort of a sense maybe, okay, then maybe those first estimates were too high. Again, it's too early to say, but right now we're at about 450,000 fatalities globally. And if you look at the curve just over time, even if we flatten it, so yeah, it would have to flatten really dramatically in order not to reach, I would say, very dramatic heights. Again, compared to other pandemics or other endemic diseases such as the seasonal flu, certainly compared to things like, you know, SARS or MERS or so on. We're talking hundreds, many hundreds of thousands at the very least of fatalities. So it's globally, and it's not receding at the moment. So right now we are in the flux in regions such as, again, if you're looking at South America, countries like Brazil, Africa, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, we're some of the maximum daily fatality counts were just in recent days in some of these countries. So we're very much still in the midst of it. The thing we're not in the midst of, and I think this is an interesting point because everybody can see the impact, the huge economic blow here, and we have the World Bank and the IMF and, you know, various research institutes looking and trying to quantify assessments of lost global GDP and unemployment rates and so on. There's no doubt we're in our opinion at least, and in our assessment, and I think most experts would agree, we're talking about something in the economically of the magnitude of the Great Depression, if not worse. But, you know, that's our ballpark. That's where we are. And the thing is, we don't necessarily yet feel the repercussions of that yet. It's a little bit like the old joke of someone who jumps off the top of a building 100 stories, and at the 42nd floor, someone asks them, well, how are you doing? So far, so good. We don't yet feel the imminence of the economic impact, especially the unemployment, and just sectors that have been decimated, you know, and worldwide, and from both sides, from the supply side and the demand side, coupled with very slim margin of monetary wiggle room because of low interest rates, huge accumulation of debt fiscally by governments, maybe rightly so, to do what they can, but at some point that's debt which is sitting there like a mountain of debt. And I think what's clear is that across the world, it seems that the prevalent, maybe with a few outliers and exceptions, certain countries in Europe also that maybe took a different view, most countries in this balance, trying to strike a balance between the health imperative, the public health imperative, and the economic imperative, struck a balance which heavily prioritized the health at the expense of the economy. So you saw system-wide national lockdown measures to various degrees, but this was really the prevailing norm in most countries. That was the balance that was struck. And part of the reason, I think, why is that the economic impact wasn't yet imminent. You had fiscal packages which are helping people, you know, go through, even if they've been laid off, weather this first wave with the hope of emerging on the other end of this and getting their jobs back or getting other jobs and just getting the economy back running. But if the economic impact really is as big as we think, and there is a second wave coming, either now or in the fall or who knows when, then it's not impossible that a different balance will be struck across most countries, just because the imminence and the dramatic nature of the economic impact will be such that governments won't be able to ignore it. And again, sort of looking another step down the road, if a different balance is struck, then the impact of that will be even higher fatalities. Because think about it, we're at 450,000 fatalities now after the balance has been struck prioritizing health. If that balance says, okay, we can't afford to do these lockdowns anymore, you're going to see even higher fatality rates with all that entails. So again, it's a lose-lose situation here. There's no easy answer. But if we're trying to sort of understand where we are and where we're headed, I guess that prognosis isn't very optimistic. I mean, if you're looking for, you said rightly, okay, so can we see also instances of optimism here? I think what Stephan pointed out about the shift in Europe from a more nationalistic and isolationist, call it, initial impulse, that's been overtaken, and to a large extent, as Stephan has pointed out, by a more cooperative and a more holistic understanding that everybody's in this together. And I think that's certainly true in Europe. To the extent that we can extend that to additional areas, the Middle East, would be an obvious candidate to sort of have this sense of international solidarity and to understand that a dramatic health and economic crisis in the Middle East would have almost certain implications on Europe also. The same is true of Africa. Maybe that can be a driver of augmented international cooperation and actually taking measures, practical measures in terms of obtaining vaccines and health centers and distributing information and hospital beds and ventilators, whatever, the whole package from the health perspective and the economic perspective. Then I think, if there's hope here, then maybe the European Union here can sort of be a light here and a model to emulate in terms of what we really need to do internationally.
Stephan?
Yeah, I don't know if I don't know what the future brings. That's open. But what I think we can say is that to some extent, Corona is what we make of it. There are opportunities and challenges, and the question is, how do we react to this? And I think the positive news, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of seconds, is that we have good examples out there that life can go on, because I think the economic impact is essential here. If economies collapse and political systems, is that the price we have to pay in order to contain the crisis? That would be very difficult. And I think the good news is that it's probably possible to reconcile these two levels. And if you look at some countries, in particular in Asia, we can actually see that it's possible to go on with life, also with economic life, with social life, but to contain the crisis and the spread of the pandemic. But let me say first, I think we see a shift now. We had the epicenter being in Europe. Now it's the United States, and that's still ongoing. If you look at the different states, the pandemic is not contained within the US. It's on the rise in some states, whereas the curve is flattening in others. But the interesting observation which we make is that the Corona pandemic now spreads to what we actually have called over the course of the last 20 years, the BRICS states, the rising powers. Remember the BRICS states, that's Brazil, it's Russia, it's India, and it's China, where the Corona pandemic actually began. And these are now the countries which are at the forefront of cases, together with the United Kingdom and the United States. So the BRICS states, which we have seen as the bedrock of a changing international system, where power has to be shared between the old guys out there, the West, and the emerging powers. These emerging powers are now really challenged by the virus. I think that's a very important observation which we have to make. And I think it's important to note as well that in particular those countries which are governed by what I would call the populist, the nationalist populist leadership, they are at the top of cases. it's the United States with Trump, it's United Kingdom with Johnson, it's Brazil, it's Russia, it's India. These are very populist governments, and I think they have a hard time struggling with the crisis. Not all populist governments or nationalist governments have had these problems. We can look at Australia and other cases. So that's I'm not making the argument that necessarily these countries run into problems, but that is definitely something which we see here and which relates to bigger cleavages about conflicts between what are perceived as political elites and those who are felt they are left behind politically, identity-wise. That's this populist cleavage which is there. So from the 8 million cases which we have right now of people infected by the coronavirus, 50% come from this national populist quintet I have just referred to. The response, I think, has to be, and there I agree with Uri, it has to be international cooperation. There has been a lot of debate, does Corona now end globalization? Is globalization a bad thing? Because it helps the virus to spread. But we all should be aware, if we look at previous pandemics, even the plague in the Roman Empire or in the medieval period, these were pandemics that were also spreading globally. It just took a bit longer until they reached the shores of Mediterranean port cities, and later on the entire continent of Europe. So, globalization is something which is out there. I think the question is, how do we make use of globalization, of global interconnectedness? And it's probably a good thing that markets turn to be more regional in the future. That might be a good thing on several levels, but we require international cooperation. Scientifically, we need it to share goods and knowledge, vaccines, the ventilators, the masks, but also the entire knowledge which is created. And I think we have several, we should think of that in terms of networks, different actors with different capacities and knowledge, and how do they connect? And that is the importance of multilateralism. And there are different levels on which this plays out. Some probably bilateral, states can cooperate, but also many states have to cooperate with experts in international organizations. And the World Health Organization, I think, is essential here. I was just thinking, we all know the World Health Organization so well because we all carry the World Health Organization in our jacket pocket. So when we go to a doctor, this is the international certificates booklet for vaccination. And I think we see some positive signs here, but there's a global battle, and I can just warn that we should not engage in this battle over the World Health Organization. And it's essential in battling the virus. And I think it's a very positive sign that just in May we had an assembly of the World Health Organization where states agreed, and actually that was sponsored by the European Union, a resolution which was sponsored by the European Union, and it was accepted by the member states of the World Health Organization that we should have broader studies, international collaboration efforts, strengthening the World Health Organization, in understanding the origins of the virus, but also agreeing that everybody on the globe should have timely and equitable access to vaccines once they arrive on the market. So that's important to see. And the World Health Organization is not just about international cooperation, it's about international solidarity between the North and the South, between the more prosperous states and the states which are poorer. So we should shift our focus to these multilateral institutions in which cooperation takes place, and I think that is very, very important here. So finally, about good examples and bad examples. I think I've talked about the bad examples. I think what we see in the crisis is that we cannot make an assessment, that states which are governed by right-wing parties or left-wing parties to good or bad. That's certainly not the case. I think what we can see, though, is that states which act strongly, where we have strong states which can act strongly, and states in which civil society cooperates and participates in measures. These are states which operate very well. And there are different good examples. I think we can see them on on every continent. The European Union was mentioned by Uri. I think that has been a good response. We should always look at the economic responses and the health responses. They are interrelated. We can look at Asia and not just the obvious cases that are often discussed like Singapore or Taiwan, but also at Japan or Thailand, which have been successful in containing the crisis. New Zealand, Australia are positive cases. So there are different cases. And you know, the common denominator is that there is this famous sentence that there is glory in prevention. There is glory in prevention. You have to react. You have to see what are the repercussions. And I'm talking of the pandemic itself, lockdown measures, also contact tracing, getting ready at hospitals, quarantine measures if they are needed. That all is proved, and masks in particular, all that has been proved in several studies, and Uri has referred to some of the Imperial College. There are many of these studies which actually show that these prevention measures are essential in containing the spread of the pandemic. And then we have the containment measures on the economic front, the big rescue packages, and the European Union is just about to set up such a big rescue package. And this is the other side of the equation that we have to think about this. And I think those countries and regions are successful, which combine the glory of prevention, both health-wise and economically.
Before we talk more about actually what will, or I'll ask you what to assess what will happen with trade and conflict, and also what you call so essential, Stephan, multilateralism. So actually, why were the countries not better prepared for the pandemic? Like you say, prevention is so important, and actually, you know, we all should take it into account for health and economy. But most of the countries, like Germany or European Union, or I guess also Israel, you have to tell me, but they were not prepared. Although they knew, like, a pandemic, it's not the first pandemic happening. Like, why were the countries not better prepared? Will that change?
Sure.
You know, I think countries were prepared in theory. Germany had a scenario of the spread of a pandemic, which was produced a couple of years ago. So in theory, this was clear, but I think it was very hard to imagine for those who have never experienced a crisis like this, what its impact going to be. In security studies, in international relations, we talk about pandemics for a long time as a security threat. But I think in the short term, we are always tempted to address the more immediate and hard security issues like armed races, or, you know, the problems the European Union has with Russia and other issues. They are more obvious in security terms. So it's very hard to address, or it has been probably very hard to address the health-related security threats. As I said before, they were more of a Hollywood movie, like Will Smith in I, Legend. You know, that's how you probably imagined these things to be. But, and this is an important part, not everybody was unprepared. And I think the reason why states in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Southeast Asia and Asia, but also probably New Zealand and Australia, those states which have experienced the SARS and the MERS pandemic, they actually were prepared. And I think, and I hope that this is the global lesson which we have, that our reaction to the corona pandemic will be the one these states, the states in Asia, but also in Oceania, like New Zealand, Australia, have, what was their conclusion from the SARS and the MERS pandemic? Their conclusion was to get ready, to prepare health systems to react early on in such a pandemic. And that should be the reaction which we probably, hopefully, we'll see globally in the future. So yeah, I don't think everybody was unprepared, and there are lessons to learn, but we have to learn these lessons. We have to really address them. We cannot ignore them.
Right. Yeah, I agree very much with Stephan's points, and he mentioned that in theory many countries were prepared, and this reminds me of Yogi Berra's famous idiom that in theory there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. So I agree very much. I think there's could put my finger on three things. Of course, the point about those countries that had experienced SARS and so on, being those that function particularly well this time, that's not an accident. I think part of it is human nature. There's the cognitive bias not to necessarily think about things that are still theoretical and haven't yet materialized. So it's partly just a sense of, part of the psychological makeup of human nature. That's number one. Why didn't countries act on things? Even though if you look on YouTube, you can find, talks, TED Talks by people like Bill Gates and others from 5 or 6 years ago, almost delineating exactly what to expect. So part of it is that. I think part of it is also the nature of politics, and particularly democratic politics, maybe, that there's a difference in timeline between sort of the schedule of what needs to be done. It's often said that if diplomacy is about surviving for the next 100 years, politics is about surviving till tomorrow morning. There's this gap, and so the nature of politics is such that it automatically creates a certain myopia on things that are actually carried out. And this is a systemic feature of politics as such. It's not particular to any particular country. And I think the last thing is resources. At the end of the day, it's one thing to know that something might happen, but it's another thing to actually devote resources now to deal with it, because it's coming at the expense of other things. And the blanket is in any country, in Germany and in Israel and everywhere. The blanket is always too small to cover everything. So it's always a tug of war over resources, and it comes down to investing in hospital beds and ventilators and masks and training teams. All of this requires the investment of resources now for something which is maybe hypothetical. There's nothing like a global pandemic on this scale to serve as a wake-up call to everybody. And I think Stephan is very much correct. It's true that it has been part of conflict studies for many years, but I think it's now surfaced to the point where public health is very concretely on the agenda of decision makers who formulate national security policies. Now, that is something which I think this crisis has changed. So I mean, we're definitely seeing it already, and we're likely to see that more as we look ahead. I just want to maybe respond and just make a comment on some of the points Stephan made earlier about the WHO. We, of course, Israel has very strong cooperation with the WHO, and I very much agree, is extremely important, both in terms of vaccines and access to vaccines, and in terms of R&D, right? Research and development on developing treatments and vaccines. So there's no question that insofar as the global multilateral arena and organizations like the WHO can be strengthened and used to address these kinds of global systemic crises, this is, of course, something we're very, very much engaged in and supportive of. So we see eye to eye on that, absolutely. Maybe one last comment just on the globalization issue, especially when it comes to things that more having to do with trade. I think here there's a big difference between, if we're speculating, obviously, looking ahead, but a big difference between short-term and medium to long-term. I think in the short term, especially insofar as the crisis is still being felt imminently in its health dimensions, it's likely that we will see a certain protectionism and an attempt to diversify supply chains and maybe nationalize certain industries and build up a certain national resilience, especially in health-related issues and maybe ancillary issues. So in the short term, we might see, and obviously, global transportation, the aviation industry, being downsized dramatically. We're seeing that already and feeling that already. That's probably going to take time to sort of come back to prior levels. I guess on this point of free trade and globalization of trade, I very much agree, I think, with Stephan's basically optimistic outlook, especially you look back at the Romans or the Greeks or the Black Death in medieval Europe and so on. At the end of the day, globalization is just it's a modern reflection. What we call globalization of trade, it's a modern reflection of a fundamental driver, I would say, of human society from time immemorial, and it probably even goes back earlier to the animal kingdom. It's essentially a reflection of the advantages of specialization and the seizing a comparative advantage. It's simply much more efficient for everybody to do what they're good at doing and then trading with others for the rest. It just makes more sense. And so economically. And so as the imminence of the health dimensions recede, as they're ultimately likely to do sooner or later, we don't know obviously, but at some point, the basic engine driving things like globalization, which is human nature in terms of profit motive and comparative advantage and technological advance, these things aren't going to change because of the crisis, I don't think. And so eventually you're going to see, I think it's going to swing back. That would be our assessment on that.
I want to stay there. So what's happening in the future, and I'll ask more hypothetical questions. Actually, you started with trade, and at the beginning, or you also said like it's massive what's happening at the economy. But you're also saying right now, actually, the globalized economy will continue. But how long? Like, what will really, happen? Like, what will be the repercussions? Will it just recover? Is it next year? Will it be the year after? Like, I know it's not. You can't say it for sure, but I want to pose my question like bigger. Like, how will our future internationally, like economy-wise, but also you're saying we have to cooperate. Like, multilateralism has to stay. But will that really happen? Like, will multilateralism win over protectionism? And like, what do you think, like looking globally, like will we cooperate in the future and that way like be aware of pandemics and deal with it, or will it actually like change? Like, also, like, how strong are international organizations right now? Will they grow stronger because of the pandemic?
I would say the following. First of all, I don't have a crystal ball to say when, and it would just be overly ambitious or pretentious to claim otherwise. So it's hard enough to speak of short term and long term without making it concrete. But there, I think we're on more solid ground. So I can see a scale back of trade globalization. Looking ahead, the shorter term, eventually, if we wait long enough, and I think, feasibly long enough, not hundreds of years, but, in terms of years, then I think the basic drivers of globalization, I don't see them being fundamentally changed. I don't think COVID is a game changer in that sense. That's what I was trying to say. I have no idea, though, exactly when, of course. What I would say, though, on your point, I think that's a very important point about international cooperation. Look, and maybe here I'm stepping out a little bit of my foreign ministry hat and more into an academic game theory hat. I think the one thing that the COVID crisis definitely does, without knowing which particular scenarios will unfold, because we don't know, it has augmented uncertainty dramatically. That's exactly the point. We do not know exactly which scenarios will be. Uncertainty is greater. So if a few years ago, if you asked policy planners or political scientists to say, what do you think will be such and such in the coming year? You would have a consensus more or less, well, more of the same with a certain tolerance level to either side. It was easier to say, yeah, more of the same. Now, all bets are off. I mean, there's just much heightened uncertainty. Why is this relevant to international cooperation? Because human cooperation, we understand today, is fundamentally linked to patience. It's fundamentally linked to thinking about the future. We cooperate in the present because we're afraid of what could happen to us in terms of our long-term relationships with others. But if our attention span towards those long-term relationships recedes because of this greater uncertainty, then our thinking becomes more short-term. That all sounds very theoretical, but it's actually anchored in a fair bit of empirical research as well, linking pandemics and presence of pathogens in populations to a decline in forward thinking and a larger emphasis placed on present or short-term thinking. And we have studies showing correlations between pandemics, pathogens, and violence, civil conflict and international conflict. So these things are actually anchored in some evidence. It's not just speculation. Bottom line, what does this mean? A crisis of this magnitude augurs ill. It bodes ill for international cooperation as such, okay? Because of this difference in patience and so on, and this attention span towards the future. So what can we do about it? That's the next question. Now, I absolutely agree that insofar as it's possible to empower organizations, professional organizations like the World Health Organization or the World Food Program or FAO or these other different organizations to administer and provide tangible assistance, aid, resources to countries and people in need, by all means, that's obviously of utmost importance. but we need to also be realistic. And the truth is that at the global level, maybe less so in professional organizations of the UN, but certainly at the level of political affinity, right? Look at the General Assembly in New York or the Security Council, or the political level at the global multilateral level. I'll be diplomatic here, it's severely challenged. Couple that with what's going on at the level of the great powers, let's call them, and in terms of the degree of tension between the great powers, which ultimately that's the bedrock of the ability of a multilateral organization such as UN organizations to function. You have to have coordination and cooperation between the great powers, otherwise it's deadlocked. The Security Council is an obvious example of this, where it's institutionally deadlocked with the vetoes once there's a disagreement amongst the permanent five, or any of the permanent five. So there's reason to be somewhat skeptical as to how much hope we should pin on the really global organizations. Again, I'm not so much referring to the World Health Organization and the other professional ones, more at the political level. One takeaway from this could be, and I think we're seeing things, and again, the EU is an example of this, where a more coherent group of like-minded, geographically and culturally close countries are able to develop a common agenda. That's also challenged, obviously. I mean, there are also major challenges to overcome in Europe, but the degree of cohesion amongst EU members is greater, I would say, than the level, if we look at all 193 countries in the world, right, at that level. And I think that's, again, it's a good example. We might want to shoot, in other words, for multiplying regional coagulations of like-minded countries as a way of buttressing international cooperation. The more of these kinds of, we call it in our planning bureau, we call it geometric diplomacy. The more of these constellations of like-minded countries, and there's an example of this just now, these days, Austria has set up a group of roughly 10 countries, Israel is one of them, countries that have been relatively successful in dealing with COVID, to deal with issues of trade and aviation and tourism and so on. That's the kind of grouping which is feasible to set up together, and which might end up providing, if we look at an aggregate level, a better aggregate result. If we have as many of these kinds of regional geometric configurations as we can, this would be very helpful. I sort of think, if you think of it metaphorically, like a link chain armor, right? The strongest link chain armor is made up of the links. You fix on the links, and then the overall product is a very, very strong and durable and flexible structure. But it's only as strong as the links are strong. And so you focus on building those links and hooking them up together, and you might have a better aggregate result.
Thank you, Uri. Stephan?
Yeah, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I also don't have a crystal ball, so I cannot really say what is going to happen. But what I would like to emphasize again is that that's life. We decide now what is going to happen. The future is open, and we cannot determine by decisions what is going to happen, but we can try to make good decisions. And I think, good decisions will come, and not everything will be positive, on 4 levels. The first one is the one mentioned by Uri right now, and this is the diplomacy game you mentioned, Uri, or the great power rivalry. This will not go away. The 21st century will be a century in which there will be a rivalry between the United States and China as the 2 big superpowers, which we have. We have to make sure, and leaders in these countries as well, that this rivalry will be managed. It will be a managed rivalry, that it will play out in competitive terms, but in peaceful terms. So that's important, but it's not going to go away. The second thing we have to prepare ourselves for by building institutions is to have what the European Union calls effective multilateralism. We have to strengthen the World Health Organization. And just as a side note, it's really disappointing to see what the United States is doing on that level, because it's ironic in a way, because the United States created all these international institutions after the Second World War. And the power of the United States derives not only from the size of its military or its economy or its way of life, but also from the fact that the United States contributed to the emergence of all these institutions, including the World Health Organization. And it's a bit self-destruction mode that there's now an attack on all these multilateral institutions from the United States. So we have to strengthen these multilateral institutions. The third element is strong governments, and there I include the European Union, the European Commission, the rescue packages, the economic packages. So we have to have strong governments. And I think what we see here is that it's not only about the big powers, we also have small states in international relations. Israel is a small state, and it's doing well and on many levels. Technology, R&D, mentioned by Uri before, and many of the leading examples of how to deal with the corona pandemic are small states. In Europe, Iceland and Croatia, one member of the EU, the other not, are leading examples here. So, but what we see here is that these are strong and effective governments, right? And the terms of kinds of regulations they have, how they manage their health systems, their economy. And here also include the European Union. And the fourth dimension is responsible society. So people have to contribute to all that. I think this is also something which we learn in this crisis, that global politics is not, it's this diplomatic game. I started with China, the United States rivalry, but it's also all of us, what we're doing every day. That's also part of international politics, by our behavior, by what we do, the solidarity we show, the masks we wear, and stuff like that. We are contributing to the question whether Corona is a game changer in global politics. And this, let me close by that, actually relates to the very purpose of these multilateral institutions. The World Health Organization was founded by the United States and others in the late 1940s in order to serve the health of all people on the globe, and also with the perspective of a more peaceful global society in mind. That was the purpose of how the World Health Organization was actually established. So my point here is that it's not about, what is going to happen, we don't know, but that we have the means, both on the level as individuals, on the level of our governments, and I agree with Uri, this is where most decisions take place in nation states, and in polities like the European Union, and finally on the level of multilateralism, that we can set a good path on which we walk through this crisis, and that's a decision which we actually can make. And this is the point I would like to stress and emphasize here.
Right. Maybe I would just make one comment, if I may. Just one comment on the World Health Organization, just to reiterate, of course, I agree with you completely. And Israel obviously very much emphasizes the importance of the World Health Organization. Just to point out, it's important, I think, also for the viewers to understand, the United States still, as of today, funds a quarter of the World Health Organization budget. So it is the prominent and the overwhelmingly the largest single donor to the World Health Organization. And I think it was in the beginning of June, Secretary of State Pompeo actually spoke quite clearly, emphasizing the importance both of the vaccine, the work on vaccines that the World Health Organization does, and research and development, R&D, and also sort of the importance to big pharma and the big pharmaceutical companies and so on. So it's still not clear where that's obviously going to, how that's going to develop, but I think it's important just that we understand that the United States is and has been, as you said rightly, founded, or was one of the important founders and important supporter of the World Health Organization for many, many decades.
The last topic I want to not really open up because we want to also come to an end of our discussion, but still, okay, we talked a lot about negative developments, but can you see also like positive or like potentials, especially like for Israel and Germany or European Union, like what can we take from the pandemic? Like I'm also thinking about like technologically wise, for example, we're all worked at home and we were surprised that actually a lot of things still did function, although we could not work like we were used to for, but because, or thanks to technology, we were still able to keep, like our consulate was always open, for example. And I know it also for the others around me or in my city or also worldwide, like life did go on, also economy did go on. So what can we, like, can you already assess that? What's maybe positive? And who wants to start?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I guess it's something endemic to Israel in general, that the necessity is always the mother of invention over here. There's no question it's a huge challenge, and we've emphasized enough of those, I think, in the last hour. But there are obvious opportunities as well, especially if you mention research and development technology. There's a lot of things which aren't, obviously there's directly related things having to do with antiviral research or biochemistry and so on, that whole domain. But there's a lot of other stuff. One of them is, you know, an example is our conference now, sort of the Zoom revolution, if you like. All of that kind of telecommunications technology, encryption, big data, AI, all of these things, there's no question that and it's already happening, that shocks of this magnitude tend to spur R&D interest, and they also draw capital. So investment capital coming in to invest in these different domains. And again, it's not a game changer in the sense that this is something completely new. These are all sort of avenues of scientific research and development which were in place and happening, but this is a major accelerator of this kind of thing. And I think there's huge potential for Israel to work. I mean, Israel obviously has a very strong high-tech sector. It's very strong capabilities in a lot of these different things in the cyber field. Again, we didn't talk about it so much, but the importance of the information, the conflict over information, or, you know, the truth about truth, as we might call it, whatever. That whole thing, which is very important to liberal democracy also, and to democratic values, that is and can be impacted very much by a lot of these technologies, by AI and big data and cyber and all of these things. So these are domains that we have a very strong joint interest. I would say the whole Euro-Atlantic community, and I'll include Israel in the Euro-Atlantic community in that sense, in terms of our basic culture and values and the importance of liberal democracy and rule of law, and free press and so on, freedom of expression. So there's a lot of room to work together. And I think this is a very important instance where the sum is bigger than the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. There's a definite synergy, and, you know, we need to just augment things that are already happening, whether it's Horizon or various different R&D programs, academic exchanges, European scholars coming to Israeli universities, vice versa, student exchanges. That whole nexus of activity is vital, I think, and there's so much to be gained on both sides. So that's number one. I think the second thing, and this goes back maybe to one of the first points I was mentioning about the Middle East, this is where we started, so we're sort of coming full circle. How, you know, given the pessimistic prognosis as to what might happen because of the crisis, as Stephan said, you know, the future is, at least partly, it's a product of the decisions we make now. And so we need to find ways to work, whether it's at the really global multilateral level, again, WHO and other such organizations, or maybe more modest initiatives, somehow to leverage and marshal the resources that we have and the know-how in Israel and in countries like Germany and other EU countries. We have to work together to find a way to stabilize these kinds of regions, again, sweeping all the way from North Africa and through the Sahel, because obviously it impacts Israel, because we're smack down right in the middle of all of this. But in a way, these, you know, Europe is also the neighbor, certainly the Southern European countries. And so I think, again, there's a lot of room to explore how we can work together to find a way to at least increase the chances of stabilizing our region. That's very important.
Okay, thank you. That was good to also think about like what will come of it, or what started and maybe accelerated also now, cooperation, research, technology in different fields. Yeah. Stephan, I also want to give the question to you, but also add a comment, and I think it's directed at you, from Daniel Erasmus Japan, and he writes, strong governments are needed, no doubt. However, in the very end, it is all about carefully balancing legitimate health concerns and civil liberties. And like he mentions, especially, is China strong, really? A role model for us?
Yeah, that's a very important comment. I saw it as well. But the point here, I think, is that if I speak about strong governments, I think these are governments which are strong in battling the health repercussions of the crisis, but a strong government is also an accountable government, strong in the terms of strengthening civil liberties. I mean, this is really essential. I think one of the problems which we sometimes have in this debate is that there's the impression that it's the or that has probably been early on in the pandemic, the impression that the authoritarian or semi-authoritarian states like Singapore, etc., that they are more successful in battling the virus. And that would be very bad news, because then the conclusion is, if that is the only way of doing it, well, that's not a very good perspective into the future. But the point here is that you can actually reconcile the two. I mean, what do we mean when we say effective governments in terms of health regulation? That is about having a strong and robust health system, hospitals, the masks, how individuals contribute through social responsibility they actually show. It's contact tracing, and on the level of contact tracing, well, yeah, you have to have a government which is responsible, which protects civil liberties. And I think the good news is here that if we really dig into responses to the corona pandemic, we can see many states which have been super successful or partly successful in battling the virus, which are civil and liberal states. States in Europe, Croatia, Iceland, I mentioned before, Germany, Italy, so many places. We can look at Japan, we can look at New Zealand, we can look at Australia. We can look at many countries in the world which are liberal democracies, where the rule of law is upheld, which are doing a good job, more or less, in battling the virus. So yes, of course, it's important, as Daniel said here, of balancing health concerns and civil liberties. But I don't think that the one comes at the expense of the other. And I think the examples I just mentioned actually show that this is really possible. And in a way, civil liberties are strengthened by the more serious debates which we have. I hope I have, I don't know if this is going to materialize, is that the kinds of discussions we have about political topics, there can be very different opinions, and ideologies are fine as well. People hold different opinions and worldviews, and that is fine. But the extreme polarization which we have seen, which even had the effect that people are contesting facts, scientific facts. I hope that this crisis will contribute to a more serious political debate, as we have it right here now in social media, like this Facebook discussions. We might not agree on all issues, but we should use all this to bring a sense of more serious debate into, and less fake news, if I may say, into the political debate. And that would be my response actually to this question, but also the kind of broader perspective.
There's another comment. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment maybe on that point as well, and just to add to what Stephan said, that I think that some of the aspects of how we need to deal with the crisis and its effects, so things like contact tracing and surveillance apps and so on, that, and if indeed the economic crisis will spur a social crisis, that will entail inevitably at some point government response to deal with social unrest. These are both things, the surveillance and that kind of thing, these are examples of things which would enable the enemies of liberal democracy to sort of try and blur the lines a little bit between the models. And I think we're already seeing some of that. And I think this requires a proactive campaign, an information campaign on the part of liberal democracies, European Union countries, Israel and other like-minded countries. The truth doesn't tell itself in this age, right? It's going to require a determined, proactive effort and maybe collaboration on public diplomacy lines as well between governments, liberal democratic governments, like-minded governments, in pushing back against that and in extolling democratic values, things that maybe for 70 years we took for granted growing up in a post-World War II order and the world order as we know it, things that we can't just hope that they'll be taken for granted anymore. We need to get out there and put that proactive messaging across. I think that's a very important agenda for liberal democratic governments.
I want to read another comment to you from Ernst Stetter. The rivalry of US-China will unfortunately shape the world, and smaller entities like EU have to cope with this. Is this difficult to manage as long Europe will not find a closer union? So maybe I can put it also, or add another question, like you said, like-minded countries have to cooperate and, cooperate in every field and really, build a shield together. Like, what do we do with China that is maybe not like-minded, but globally also economically, like we can't, should we try not to cooperate that much? Or, yeah, I just also want to add this to the comment. I don't know who wants to answer first.
Stephan, please.
Yeah, I think the US-China rivalry is there to stay. This will define the 21st century. And if you look at policy debates in Beijing and Washington, D.C., you should have no illusions that this is very essential to the foreign policy debates which are. Yes, exactly, this is the point. The European Union is small, and then member states of the European Union, all member states of the European Union are medium-sized states in the end, and only by acting together, Europe can take care of itself. And Europe has a strong relationship with the United States. I think it's going to stay. There are many similarities, but it's not necessarily always a shared interest the European Union and EU member states have with the United States. So it would be very problematic if the European Union would have to choose sides. This is definitely not what should happen. And so we have to manage this rivalry of the United States and China. That's the responsibility of these two superpowers, and that is not something that can be managed from Brussels, from Paris, Rome, or Warsaw. But what people in Warsaw, in Rome, in Madrid, in other places, also in Munich, can actually do is to, yeah, as stated here in the question, to make the European Union stronger in international politics. This is something that has to be done, and further anchoring the European Union as a player in international politics. I referred to the World Health Organization before. I think we see on many levels that the EU is doing that also in trade terms, and then we should add other layers to that as well, and disengage as much as possible from a US-Chinese conflict. I think that's the message that is there for Europe.
But I think the comment also can be valid for Israel. So what's Israel's role between China and the US? Uri, I'm giving to you.
Yeah. Here, maybe I would just emulate some of our Supreme Court justices, when there's a panel of judges and one judge holds the pen, so he'll write 80, 90 pages of a judicial statement and judicial reasoning, and the other judges will just write, I agree. So basically, okay. I agree with what Stephan.
Not only true for the European Union, but also for other countries.
Yeah, it's a delicate issue.
Okay. So thank you very much, Uri and Stephan, for having this talk with us. I enjoyed it really much. I also learned a lot. It's a difficult topic looking globally right now. There's really a lot of uncertainty, but you cleared a lot of questions for me. Although you don't have the crystal ball, which I'm really disappointed about. So thank you, and I hope next time
we'll work on it in our R&D. Sorry.
Pardon?
We'll work on the crystal ball and our joint R&D.
Okay, next time we have the crystal ball with us. Great. So thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day and stay healthy. And yeah, and I also wish our audience a great day. Thank you for being with us, and I hope you join one of our next webinars. goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.